Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales, and before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. In the heart of the unforgiving West, a desperate whisper hangs in the air of a secluded cabin, a plea for an end. But when a hard-bitten rancher is faced with this desperate plea, his next move will defy all expectations and ignite a story of survival, grit, and the forging of an unbreakable bond against the backdrop of a wild and tamed land. Chapter 1: A Whisper in the Dust. The cabin was a box of trapped heat and simmering despair. Dust motes, thick as summer locusts, danced in the single shaft of sunlight that pierced the gloom, illuminating the stark reality of Mary's confinement. Outside, the Wyoming wind howled a mournful dirge across the plains, a constant reminder of the vast, indifferent wilderness that held her captive. It had been weeks, or was it months? Time had bled into a single, agonizing smear of pain and fear. Her world had shrunk to the four rough-hewn log walls of this isolated ranch house, a prison built not of iron bars, but of circumstance and the silent, brooding presence of the man who held her fate in his calloused hands. He was known only as Cain, a name that seemed to fit the harsh lines of his face and the cold, flinty gray of his eyes. He wasn't her captor in the traditional sense. He had found her half dead, a lone survivor of a Comanche raid on her family's wagon train. He had brought her here, to this remote corner of his sprawling cattle empire, and nursed her back to a semblance of health. But in his detached, almost brutal efficiency, she found no comfort, only a different kind of cage. The physical wounds had begun to scar over, but the ones etched into her soul festered. The images of the raid, of her parents' and younger brother's last moments, played on a ceaseless loop behind her eyes. Every gust of wind carried the echoes of war cries, every shadow held the phantom shapes of painted warriors. The grief was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest until she felt she couldn't draw a full breath. It was a suffocating shroud she couldn't escape, not even in the fitful, nightmare-plagued snatches of sleep she managed. Cain was a man of few words, a monolith of quiet strength and unnerving stillness. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a life lived on the edge, where wasted energy could mean the difference between life and death. He provided for her basic needs: food, water, shelter, the occasional change of clean, of course, linen. He would enter the small room where she lay, place a tray of food on the rickety bedside table, and leave without a word. His silence was a wall she couldn't penetrate, his stoicism a mirror to the vast, empty landscape that surrounded them. He was as much a part of this harsh land as the granite peaks that clawed at the sky in the distance. Today, the despair had reached its zenith. The pain, a dull, throbbing ache that was more emotional than physical, had become a living entity, a parasite feeding on her will to live. She watched the dust motes swirl, each one a tiny, insignificant speck, just like her. Her life, once so full of promise and hope, had been reduced to this waiting. Waiting for what? For a rescue that would never come. For the grief to magically subside. For the nightmares to cease their nightly assault. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that none of those things would happen. The Comanches had been thorough. There was no one left to search for her. The wild and tamed West had swallowed her family whole, and she was merely the last, indigestible morsel. Her throat was a dessert, her lips cracked and peeling. When she finally found her voice, it was a sound she barely recognized, a fragile, rasping whisper that was almost lost in the keening of the wind. "Do it fast, I can't take it anymore." The words hung in the charged silence of the room. She hadn't even realized Cain was there, standing in the doorway, a silhouette against the brighter light of the main cabin. He had the nerving ability to move with the silence of a predator, a trait that had likely kept him alive in this brutal land. He held a steaming mug in one hand, the aroma of strong coffee and chicory cutting through the stale air. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, his shadow stretching long and dark across the floorboards. To Mary, his silence was an answer in itself. He was a practical man, a man who understood the harsh realities of life and death. A horse with a broken leg was shot. A cow with the black leg was put down. A woman with a broken spirit, what was the difference? She was a burden, a ghost haunting his home, a constant reminder of the violence that was an ever-present threat in this territory. The people she had encountered in her brief time in the West, the hard-bitten settlers and grizzled trappers, all shared a common trait, a pragmatism born of necessity. Sentimentality was a luxury they couldn't afford. Mercy was often swift and final. She expected him to turn, to retrieve the cold peacemaker she knew he wore strapped to his hip, and to grant her the release she so desperately craved. It would be a final, brutal act of kindness. The air in the room grew thick with unspoken words, with the weight of her plea and the gravity of his decision. The seconds stretched into an eternity. The rhythmic ticking of a mantel clock in the other room seemed to mock her, each tick a tiny hammer blow against her frayed nerves. She closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. She pictured her mother's smile, her father's booming laugh, her brother's mischievous grin. The memories were no longer a comfort, but a source of fresh agony. "Please," she whispered again, her voice cracking. "I want to be with them." The silence that followed was different this time. It was not the silence of indifference, but the silence of contemplation. She could feel his gaze on her, intense and unwavering. It was as if he were seeing her for the first time, not as a broken piece of flotsam washed up on his doorstep, but as a person. When he finally moved, it was not towards the door to fetch his gun. He crossed the room in 3 long, deliberate strides, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He placed the mug on the bedside table, the ceramic clinking softly against the wood. The scent of the coffee was stronger now, a dark, earthy aroma that seemed to anchor her to the present moment, pulling her back from the precipice of oblivion. He loomed over her, a mountain of a man, his shadow eclipsing the single shaft of sunlight. She braced herself, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it, the end. But instead of the cold, hard steel of a gun barrel, she felt the unexpected warmth of his hand. It was large and calloused, the skin rough from years of handling ropes, tools, and the reins of a horse. His fingers gently, almost reverently, closed around her own. Her hand was lost in his, a fragile bird in a weathered cage. The contact was a jolt to her system, a spark of warmth in the icy void of her despair. It was the first human touch she had experienced that wasn't clinical or detached since the raid. It was a touch that spoke not of pity, but of something else, something she couldn't quite name. She opened her eyes, her gaze locking with his. The flinty gray of his eyes was no longer cold and distant. In their depths, she saw a flicker of something she had never seen before, a fierce and yielding resolve. It was the look of a man who had faced down blizzards, droughts, and stampedes and had refused to be broken. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and gravelly, the sound of rocks tumbling in a dry riverbed, but it held a power that resonated deep within her, a force that seemed to push back against the encroaching darkness. No, the word was a single, hard stone dropped into the placid pool of her resignation. It was not the answer she had expected, not the answer she had begged for. It was a denial, a refusal of her deepest wish. A wave of anger, hot and sharp, pierced through the fog of her grief. Who was he to deny her this? Who was he to decide her fate? But before she could voice her protest, he spoke again, his grip on her hand tightening, not with force, but with an intensity that brooked no argument. "We fight." The words were not a suggestion, not a question. They were a declaration, a statement of intent. The plural, "we," echoed in the small room, a startling and unexpected alliance. He wasn't just telling her to fight, he was telling her she wouldn't be fighting alone. He leaned closer, his face etched with a grim determination. "This land," he said, his voice a low rumble, "it takes. It takes, and it takes, and it never gives a damn thing back unless you rip it from its clutches. It took your family. It's trying to take you. We're not gonna let it." For the first time since she had woken up in this strange cabin, Mary saw past the stoic rancher, the silent enigma. She saw a man who understood the cruelty of this world, who had likely suffered his own losses, his own battles. In his eyes, she saw not pity, but a reflection of her own pain, tempered with a resilience that she had thought was long dead within herself. The shock of his words, of his actions, was a bucket of ice water thrown on the embers of her despair. It didn't extinguish them completely, but it sent a hiss of steam and a jolt of sensation through her numb existence. He was offering her not an end, but a beginning. A beginning she didn't want, a fight she didn't have the strength for. But his unwavering gaze, his unyielding grip, his too simple, powerful words "we fight" had planted a seed of something she hadn't felt in a long, long time. A tiny, fragile, almost imperceptible seed of hope. He released her hand and straightened up, his towering presence once again filling the room. He picked up the mug of coffee. "Drink this," he said, his tone back to its usual brusque command. "You'll need your strength." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving her alone with the swirling dust motes, the howling wind, and the echo of his words. The cabin was still a prison, the wilderness still a threat, the grief still a gaping wound. But something had shifted. The air was no longer thick with the finality of death, but with the terrifying, exhilarating possibility of life. Mary looked at the steaming mug, its dark contents mirroring the darkness she felt inside. But it was also warm, a small island of heat in the cold landscape of her sorrow. With a trembling hand, she reached for it. The ceramic was warm against her cold fingers. She brought it to her lips and took a sip. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it was also hot and real. And as she drank, she realized that the rancher had done something far more shocking than pulling a trigger. He had pulled her back from the brink, not with gentle words of comfort, but with a harsh, unyielding demand. He had demanded that she live. And for the first time in a very long time, a part of her, a small, forgotten part, began to consider the possibility of obeying. The fight had just begun. Chapter 2, The Forge of the Soul. The days that followed were a crucible. Cain's declaration, "We fight," was not a gentle promise of comfort. It was a command, an iron gauntlet thrown down against the encroaching shadows of Mary's grief. The fight, she soon learned, was not a grand, dramatic battle, but a grueling, relentless war of attrition waged against the inertia of her own despair. It was a war fought in the small, mundane moments of each day, a war for which Cain was a harsh and unforgiving drill sergeant. His methods were devoid of coddling or sentimentality. He was not a man of soft words or soothing platitudes. He was a man of action, and he demanded the same of her. The morning after his refusal, he entered her room not with a tray of food, but with a bucket of cold water and a rough cloth. "The self-pity ends today," he announced, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You smell like a sickness. Get yourself clean." The shock of his words was followed by a surge of indignant anger. How dare he? How dare he speak to her of self-pity when her entire world had been burned to ashes? But as she looked into his unyielding gray eyes, she saw no malice, only a stark and wavering purpose. He was not trying to be cruel. He was trying to break the spell of her lethargy. He left the bucket and cloth and returned a few minutes later with a clean, simple calico dress. It was worn and faded, but mended with neat, small stitches. He laid it on the foot of her bed. "When you're done, come to the main room. There's work to be done." The cold water was a shock to her system, a brutal but effective antidote to the warm, stagnant cocoon of her sorrow. As she washed away the grime of the past weeks, she felt as if she were sloughing off a layer of her grief, exposing the raw, tender skin beneath. The simple act of dressing herself, of pulling the clean, coarse fabric over her head, was an effort that left her trembling with exhaustion. But it was also the first autonomous decision she had made in months. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. When she finally emerged from the room, blinking in the brighter light of the main cabin, she found Cain at a large wooden table, meticulously cleaning a rifle. The cabin was larger than she had realized, a single, cavernous room that served as a kitchen, living area, and workshop. It was a space that was ruthlessly functional, stripped of any ornamentation save for a few faded maps tacked to the wall and a small, well-worn Bible on the mantelpiece. The air smelled of wood smoke, leather, and gunpowder. He didn't look up as she entered, but continued his work, his hands moving with a practiced, almost surgical precision. "There's a pot of stew on the stove," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Eat all of it." The stew was thick and hearty, filled with chunks of venison and root vegetables. It was not a meal meant to be savored, but a meal meant to provide fuel. And as she forced herself to eat, spoonful by spoonful, she felt a flicker of strength return to her limbs. It was the first real food she had tasted in weeks, the first time she had eaten not out of a sense of obligation, but out of a dawning recognition of her body's needs. Cain's training, as she came to think of it, was relentless. He started with the basics, tasks designed to pull her out of her own head and ground her in the physical reality of the world around her. He taught her how to mend clothes, not with the delicate embroidery she had learned back east, but with the strong, practical stitches needed to patch a pair of canvas trousers or a torn leather glove. He taught her how to knead bread, her small, soft hands struggling with the stiff, resistant dough. He taught her how to churn butter, the rhythmic, monotonous motion, a form of meditation, a way to occupy her mind with a simple, tangible task. Each task was a lesson in survival, a building block in the reconstruction of her shattered world. He was teaching her not just how to live, but how to be useful, how to be a part of the unforgiving ecosystem of the West. In this world, there was no room for idle hands or idle minds. To be idle was to invite despair, to surrender to the vast, overwhelming emptiness of the landscape. He was a patient, if demanding teacher. He would demonstrate a task once, his movements economical and precise, and then he would watch her, his silence a heavy weight, as she struggled to replicate his efforts. He never offered praise, but she could see a flicker of something akin to approval in his eyes when she finally mastered a new skill. The physical work was exhausting, but it was also a balm to her wounded spirit. The simple, repetitive tasks gave her a sense of purpose, a reason to get out of bed in the morning. The soreness in her muscles was a welcome distraction from the ache in her heart. And as her hands grew calloused and her body grew stronger, she found that the nightmares began to recede, their power diminished by the sheer physical exhaustion of her days. But Kane's training was not limited to domestic chores. He was determined to strip away every last vestige of the helpless, fragile woman she had once been. One afternoon, he led her out of the cabin and into the vast, sun-drenched expanse of his ranch. The sheer scale of the landscape was dizzying, a panorama of rolling hills, distant, snow-capped mountains, and a sky so vast it seemed to press down on the earth. He took her to a small corral where a dozen or so horses milled about, their coats shimmering in the sunlight. He pointed to a small, weary Mustang, its eyes wild and untamed. "That one's yours," he said. "You'll learn to ride." The thought of mounting the creature, of entrusting her life to its raw and tamed power, was terrifying. But she saw the challenge in Kane's eyes, the unspoken dare, and she knew that to refuse would be to admit defeat, to retreat back into the comfortable misery of her grief. The first few lessons were a brutal comedy of errors. She was thrown more times than she could count, her body a collection of bruises and scrapes. Each time she hit the dirt, the wind knocked out of her, she would look up to see Kane standing by the fence, his face impassive, his arms crossed over his broad chest. He never offered a hand to help her up, never offered a word of sympathy. He would simply wait until she had picked herself up, dusted herself off, and was ready to try again. It was a harsh and forgiving pedagogy, but it was effective. She learned to anticipate the horse's movements, to feel the subtle shift of its muscles beneath her, to move with it, not against it. She learned to grip with her legs, to balance with her core, to become an extension of the animal itself. And one day, she found herself not just staying on, but riding, the wind whipping through her hair, a sense of exhilaration, of freedom she hadn't felt in a lifetime. The final piece of her education was the most difficult, the most terrifying. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and red, Kane laid his cold peacemaker on the table between them. The gun was a thing of brutal beauty, its blued steel gleaming in the lamplight. "You need to learn how to use this," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. The sight of the gun sent a jolt of ice through her veins. It was a tangible symbol of the violence that had destroyed her life, the instrument of her family's death. The thought of holding it, of feeling its weight in her hand, was repellent. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't." For the first time since he had made his declaration, she saw a flicker of something other than grim determination in Kane's eyes. It was not pity, but a deep, resonant understanding. He had seen the horrors of this land, had likely committed his own acts of violence in the name of survival. He knew the weight of what he was asking. "You can," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "And you will. Out here, a gun is not a choice. It's a tool. It's the difference between being the hunter and the hunted. You've been the hunted. It's time you learn to be the hunter." He took her out to a secluded clearing, a small, natural amphitheater surrounded by tall pines. He set up a row of empty bottles on a fallen log and patiently, methodically, taught her the mechanics of the gun, how to load it, how to aim it, how to control her breathing. how to squeeze the trigger without flinching. The first time she fired the gun, the recoil was a violent shock, a brutal assertion of the weapon's power. The noise was deafening, a roar that echoed through the quiet forest. The smell of gunpowder was acrid and sharp, a scent that brought back a fresh wave of memories, of screams and smoke and the coppery tang of blood. She dropped the gun as if it were a hot coal and stumbled back, tears streaming down her face. Cain didn't move to comfort her. He simply stood there, a silent, immovable presence, and waited for the storm to pass. He let her weep, let her rage, let her confront the demons the sound of the gunshot had resurrected. And when she was finally spent, her sobs subsiding into shuddering breaths, he picked up the gun and placed it back in her trembling hands. Again, he said, his voice a quiet command. And so she did. Again and again and again. With each shot, the recoil became less of a shock, the noise less of a trauma. With each shot, she learned to control her fear, to channel it into a cold, focused anger. She was no longer just a victim, she was a survivor. And as she finally, miraculously, shattered one of the bottles, sending a spray of glass glittering in the fading light, she felt a sense of empowerment, of agency. She had thought was lost to her forever. She had been forged in the crucible of her grief, tempered by the harsh and forgiving love of a man who had refused to let her die. She was no longer the fragile, broken woman who had whispered a plea for death in a dusty, sun-drenched cabin. She was a woman of the West, a woman who knew how to mend a fence, ride a horse, and fire a gun. She was still wounded, still scarred, but she was no longer broken. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, she believed it was a fight she could win. And as she walked back to the cabin, the heavy weight of the Colt on her hip, she knew that she was no longer a prisoner of her past, but the architect of her own future. The rancher had not just saved her life, he had given her the tools to build a new one. And in the heart of the wild and forgiving West, that was the greatest gift of all. Chapter 3: Echoes in the Canyon. The rhythm of life on the ranch settled into a predictable, yet demanding, cadence. Sunup to sundown, the work was relentless, a constant battle against the encroaching wilderness and the whims of a land that was as likely to kill you as it was to sustain you. Mary, once a stranger in this harsh landscape, now moved with a growing sense of purpose, her body hardened, her spirit tempered in the forge of Cain's tutelage. The memory of the woman she once was, a woman who fainted at the sight of a mouse and considered a broken teacup a tragedy, seemed like a ghost from another lifetime. But the past was not a ghost that could be easily exorcised. It lingered in the periphery, a shadow that stretched long in the afternoon sun, a whisper on the wind that rustled through the cottonwoods by the creek. Though she had learned to shoot, to ride, to survive, the echoes of the raids still reverberated in the quiet canyons of her mind. One sweltering afternoon, while mending a stretch of fence on the far side of the property, the echo became a roar. She was alone, Cain having ridden out early to check on a line of traps he'd set in the high country. The sun beat down with a merciless intensity, the air thick and still. The only sounds were the buzz of insects and the rhythmic tap of her hammer against the fence post. It was a sound, a smell, that triggered it. The nicker of a horse from a nearby thicket, the sudden, sharp scent of wood smoke where there should have been none. Her head snapped up, her hand instinctively going to the Colt holstered at her hip. The hammer felt cool and solid beneath her palm, a comforting weight. She scanned the horizon, her eyes narrowed against the glare. The landscape was empty, a vast, undulating sea of brown and green. But the feeling of being watched, a primal, prickling sensation on the back of her neck, was undeniable. She was not alone. And then she saw them. 3 riders, cresting a small rise, their figures silhouetted against the brilliant blue of the sky. They were too far away to make out their features, but their clothing, their posture, the way they sat their horses, was instantly, chillingly familiar. They were not cowboys. They were not settlers. They were warriors. The blood in her veins turned to ice. It was them. The same tribe, the same painted faces, the same feathered lances that had haunted her nightmares for months. The world around her seemed to warp and distort, the vibrant colors of the landscape fading to a dull, washed-out gray. The air grew thick and heavy, the sounds of the prairie replaced by a rushing in her ears, the phantom echoes of war cries and screams. She was paralyzed, her feet rooted to the spot, her mind a maelstrom of terror and grief. She was that helpless girl again, hiding in the back of a wagon, listening to the sounds of her family being slaughtered. The Colt at her hip felt impossibly heavy, a useless piece of metal. The riders had seen her. They reined in their horses, their voices carrying on the still air, a series of guttural commands she couldn't understand but whose meaning was terrifyingly clear. They began to spread out, a classic flanking maneuver, their movements fluid and practiced, the movements of predators closing in on their prey. This was it. The end she had once so desperately craved was now a terrifying, imminent reality. But as the first rider let out a piercing war cry, a sound that ripped through the fabric of her paralysis, something inside her snapped. It was Kane's voice, a low, gravelly echo in the canyon of her mind. "You've been the hunted. It's time you learned to be the hunter." The words were a spark in the darkness, igniting a flicker of something she hadn't known she possessed, a fierce, primal will to survive. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but it was no longer in control. It was fuel. She ripped the Colt from its holster, the practiced motion a testament to her long hours of training. She didn't run. There was nowhere to run. She stood her ground, her back to the fence post, her body a small, defiant island in a sea of hostile wilderness. She raised the gun, her hand surprisingly steady, and took aim at the lead rider. He was closer now, his face a horrifying mask of red and black paint, his eyes burning with a savage intensity. She could see the intricate beadwork on his leather vest, the eagle feather tied in his long, black hair. He was no longer a phantom from her nightmares. He was a man of flesh and blood, a man who intended to kill her. She remembered Kane's instructions, his voice a calm, steady presence in the chaos of the moment. "Control your breathing. Squeeze the trigger. Don't jerk it." She took a deep breath, held it, and squeezed. The gun bucked in her hand, the report a deafening roar that shattered the afternoon silence. The rider jerked in his saddle, a look of stunned surprise on his face. A small, dark flower blossomed on his chest. He hung there for a moment, a grotesque puppet whose strings had been cut, and then he pitched forward, tumbling from his horse to lie in a crumpled heap in the dust. The other two riders reined in their horses, their triumphant war cries dying in their throats. They stared at their fallen comrade, then at the small, solitary figure of the woman who had shot him. Their expressions were a mixture of shock and disbelief. The moment of hesitation was all she needed. She cocked the hammer again, the metallic click a sound of deadly intent. She aimed at the second rider, her heart hammering against her ribs, a wild, exultant energy coursing through her veins. This time, they didn't give her the chance. With a shout of alarm, they wheeled their horses around and galloped away, disappearing over the rise as quickly as they had appeared. Mary stood there, the gun still raised, her body trembling with the aftershocks of adrenaline. The silence that descended was more profound than before, broken only by the buzzing of the insects and the soft whinny of the dead man's horse, which stood a short distance away, its reins trailing in the dust. The world slowly came back into focus, the colors returning to the landscape, the sounds of the prairie reasserting themselves. She looked at the man she had killed, his body a stark, final testament to the brutal reality of this land. There was no triumph, no satisfaction, only a hollow, aching emptiness. She had taken a life. She had become a killer. She didn't know how long she stood there, the gun growing heavy in her hand, her mind a numb, echoing void. It was the sound of approaching hoofbeats, fast and urgent, that finally broke the spell. She whirled around, her gun raised, her heart leaping into her throat. It was Kane. He reined in his horse a few feet away, his eyes taking in the scene in a single, sweeping glance, the dead warrior, the riderless horse, the gun in Mary's hand, the look of shock on her face. He dismounted, his movements swift and economical. He didn't speak, but walked over to her and gently, firmly, took the gun from her hand. He looked at it, then at her, his expression unreadable. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. She shook her head, unable to find her voice. He holstered the Colt, and then, to her utter astonishment, he reached out and placed his hands on her shoulders. His touch was firm, grounding, a silent acknowledgement of the ordeal she had just endured. "You did good," he said, his voice quiet but resonant. "You did what you had to do." And then he did something even more unexpected. He pulled her to him, his arms wrapping around her in a rough, awkward embrace. It was not a gesture of passion, but of comfort, of solidarity. He was a rock in the storm of her emotions, a steady presence in a world that had once again tilted on its axis. She buried her face in his chest, the rough fabric of his shirt scratching her cheek, the scent of leather and sweat and horse filling her senses. And for the first time since the raid, she allowed herself to cry. Not the silent, despairing tears of a victim, but the ragged, cathartic sobs of a survivor. She cried for her family, for the life she had lost, for the woman she had once been. She cried for the men she had just killed, for the brutal and forgiving cycle of violence that defined this land. And she cried with a sense of profound, overwhelming relief, for the simple, miraculous fact that she was still alive. Cain held her, his silence a comforting blanket, until the storm of her grief had passed. He then gently pushed her back, his hands still on her shoulders, and looked into her eyes. "It's not over," he said, his voice grim. "They'll be back. And they'll be back in greater numbers." The words were a chilling reminder that her ordeal was far from over. She had won a battle, but the war was just beginning. But as she looked into Cain's steady, resolute eyes, she knew that she would not be facing it alone. They had a lot to do. They had to fortify the cabin, bring in the livestock, prepare for a siege. But as they worked, a new sense of purpose, of partnership, settled between them. They were no longer just a man and a woman thrown together by circumstance. They were a team, unit, bound together by a shared experience of violence and a common will to survive. The echoes of the canyon had been a terrifying reminder of her past, but they had also been a crucible, a test of her newfound strength. She had faced her demons and had not been found wanting. She had learned that she was not just a survivor, but a fighter. And in the heart of the wild and forgiving West, that was a lesson more valuable than gold. The fight for the ranch, for their lives, had begun in earnest. And Mary, for the first time, was ready for it. Chapter 4: The Siege of Bitter Creek. The sun bled across the western horizon, painting the clouds in violent strokes of crimson and orange, a grim portent of the bloodshed to come. The air, usually filled with the gentle sounds of dusk chirp of crickets, the lowing of cattle was heavy with a tense, expectant silence. Every gust of wind sounded like a war cry. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden threat. The war party was coming. Cain knew it with the certainty of a man who had spent his life reading the subtle, deadly language of the frontier. After Mary's confrontation at the fenceland, they had worked with a feverish, silent intensity. There was no wasted motion, no unnecessary conversation. They were two parts of a single machine, their actions driven by the shared and spoken understanding of the mortal peril they faced. Cain, a grim-faced general, surveyed his small fortress, his mind a whirlwind of tactics and calculations. Mary, his determined soldier, followed his commands without question, her fear a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but her hands steady, her resolve unbroken. They had brought the horses and the few milk cows into the sturdy corral behind the cabin, the animals' nervous energy a palpable reflection of their own. They had boarded up the smaller windows, leaving only narrow slits for firing, turning the simple log home into a makeshift blockhouse. Barrels of water were filled and placed strategically, sacks of flour and salted meat piled against the walls. Ammunition boxes were opened, their contents gleaming brass cartridges laid out on the main table like a surgeon's instruments. Cain's collection of firearms, a Winchester repeating rifle, a double-barreled shotgun, and his ever-present Colt, were cleaned, oiled, and loaded. Mary, handling the weapons that had once filled her with such revulsion, felt a strange sense of detachment. The girl who had wept at the sound of a gunshot was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that these objects of wood and steel were the only things standing between her and a brutal death. She loaded the Winchester with a practiced efficiency, the metallic click of each cartridge sliding into the magazine a small, defiant sound against the encroaching silence. As darkness fell, a full moon rose, bathing the landscape in an ethereal, silver light. It was a beautiful, terrible moon, a spotlight that would offer them no place to hide. Cain extinguished the lanterns in the cabin, plunging them into a deep gloom, pierced only by the pale moonlight filtering through the firing slits. "They'll come before dawn," he said, his voice a low rumble in the darkness. "They'll try to use the shadows, getting close before we can see them." He was standing by the main window, a dark, imposing silhouette against the moonlit landscape. "How many?" Mary asked, her own voice a little more than a whisper. "Hard to say. 10, 20, maybe more. They'll want revenge for their fallen warrior. It's a matter of honor. A matter of honor." The words seemed so alien, so out of place in the face of the brutal violence she knew was coming. But she understood. It was a code, a law of this wild land, as immutable as the rising of the sun. Blood for blood. They took up their positions, Cain at the front window, Mary at a smaller slit overlooking the side of the cabin. The hours crawled by, each tick of the mantel clock a hammer blow against the taut wire of their nerves. The silence was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that threatened to suffocate them. Mary's mind, despite her best efforts, began to play tricks on her. The wind whistling through the eaves sounded like the whisper of her mother's voice. The rustle of a tumbleweed against the cabin wall sounded like the furtive footsteps of an approaching warrior. She gripped the cool stock of the Winchester, the solid feel of the wood a comforting anchor in the swirling sea of her fear. It was just before the first hint of dawn, and that deep, inky blackness that precedes the light, that they came, not with a wild, whooping charge, but with the silent, terrifying stealth of ghosts. One moment the landscape was empty, the next it was filled with dark, fleeting shapes, moving from shadow to shadow with a deadly, serpentine grace. "They're here," Cain breathed, his voice a low, urgent warning. Mary's heart leaped into her throat. She peered through her firing slit, her eyes straining in the darkness. She could see them now, a dozen or more warriors, their bodies slick with war paint that gleamed in the faint moonlight. They were fanning out, encircling the cabin, their movements a silent, deadly ballet. The first arrow struck the cabin with a soft, dull thud, the sound shockingly intimate in the charged silence. It was followed by another, and another, a sudden, deadly rain of feathered shafts. One zipped through Mary's firing slit, embedding itself in the log wall just inches from her head. She flinched back, a small gasp escaping her lips. "Hold your fire," Cain commanded, his voice a steel whip. "Don't waste your shots. Wait until they're in the open." The warriors, emboldened by the lack of response, began to move closer. They were a creeping tide of death, their dark forms emerging from the shadows, their intent clear. They were going to try to set the cabin ablaze. One warrior, braver or more foolish than the rest, broke from cover, a flaming torch held high in his hand. He sprinted towards the cabin, his painted face a mask of savage fury in the flickering firelight. "Now," Cain said, his voice cold and flat. The Winchester roared, the sound a deafening explosion in the confined space of the cabin. The warrior with the torch crumpled, the torch flying from his hand and extinguishing in the dirt. The shot was a signal. The night erupted into a cacophony of sound, guttural war cries of their attackers, the thunderous reports of Cain's rifle and Mary's shotgun, the splintering of wood as bullets and arrows found their marks. The battle became a blur of motion and sound, a chaotic, terrifying dance of death. Mary fired and reloaded, her actions a mechanical, desperate rhythm. She was no longer thinking, only reacting, her entire being focused on the single, overriding imperative to survive. She saw a warrior emerge from the shadows near the corral, his intent to stampede the horses. She aimed the shotgun, the weapon's wide blast a more forgiving choice for a moving target, and fired. The warrior was thrown back, his body a broken, twisted shape. But for every one they brought down, another seemed to take his place. They were a relentless, inexorable force, their courage fueled by a righteous fury. They were fighting for their land, for their honor, for their fallen comrade. Mary, in a strange, terrifying moment of clarity, understood that in their eyes, she and Cain were the invaders, the interlopers. The battle raged on, the hours blurring into a single, continuous nightmare. The air in the cabin grew thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder, the scent of fear and sweat. Mary's shoulder ached from the recoil of the shotgun, her ears rang from the constant explosions. They were running low on ammunition. Cain's movements became more measured, his shots more carefully chosen. Mary, her shotgun shells expended, switched to the smaller, less powerful revolvers she had taken from the man she had killed at the fence line. The sky began to lighten in the east, the darkness giving way to the pale, gray light of dawn. The warriors, knowing their cover of darkness was fading, grew more desperate, their attacks more reckless. A group of them made a concerted rush on the front door, using a large log as a battering ram. The heavy oak door groaned under the impact, the wood splintering, the iron hinges straining. "The door won't hold," Mary cried, her voice raw with fear. Kane moved from the window, his face a grim mask of determination. He braced his shoulder against the door, his body a living barricade. "Keep firing," he yelled. "Don't let them get close." The door splintered, a large crack appearing down its center. A painted face appeared in the opening, its eyes wide with savage triumph. Mary raised the revolver, her hand trembling, and fired. The face disappeared, but another took its place. And another. They were a tide of humanity, a wave of death that was about to break over them. This was the end. The thought was not one of despair, but of a strange, quiet resignation. They had fought hard. They had fought together. But it was not enough. And then, just as the door was about to give way, just as the last of their hope was about to be extinguished, a new sound entered the fray. A sound that was as unexpected as it was welcome. The clear, clarion call of a bugle. The warriors at the door froze, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the thunder of 100 galloping hooves and the unmistakable crackle of carbine fire. Cavalry. The warriors, caught between the fortified cabin and the charging line of blue-coated soldiers, hesitated for a moment, their attack faltering. That moment of indecision was their undoing. The cavalry troop, a vision of disciplined, deadly force, crashed into their flank, their sabers flashing in the morning sun, their carbines spitting fire. The battle, which had been a desperate, chaotic siege, became a rout. The warriors, their surprise attack broken, their numbers dwindling, melted back into the wilderness, their war cries replaced by the shouts of the soldiers and the screams of the wounded. The silence that descended in the aftermath was broken only by the whimpering of a wounded horse and the low, pained groans of the dying. Mary leaned against the wall, the revolver slipping from her nerveless fingers, her body trembling with a combination of exhaustion, fear, and a profound, overwhelming relief. The cabin door, or what was left of it, was kicked open. A young cavalry officer, his blue uniform stained with dust and sweat, stood in the doorway, a smoking pistol in his hand. He took in the Senate-fortified cabin, the spent cartridges littering the floor, the grim-faced rancher and the pale, exhausted woman, his expression a mixture of surprise and admiration. "Looks like we got here just in the nick of time," he said, a wry smile touching his lips. Kane simply nodded, his face still a mask of grim exhaustion. He looked at Mary, his eyes meeting hers across the smoke-filled room. In their depths, she saw not triumph, not relief, but a shared, unspoken understanding of the terrible cost of their survival. They had lived. They had won. But the siege of Bitter Creek had left its mark on both of them, a scar on their souls that would never fully fade. They had faced the darkness together, and in the crucible of that long, bloody night, a bond had been forged between them, bond of shared experience, of mutual respect, of a deep and spoken understanding that was stronger than steel. The war was over, but the peace was a fragile, hard-won thing, and they both knew that in this wild and forgiving land, the next battle was never far away. Chapter 5: The Scars of the Land. The cavalry, a transient blue wave of order in the vast, chaotic sea of the frontier, did not linger. They were a force of reaction, of retribution, not of permanent protection. After a day of burying the dead, a grim, silent task shared by the soldiers and the two inhabitants of the besieged cabin, and a perfunctory investigation by the young, clean-shaven lieutenant. They were gone, their bugle calls fading into the immense, indifferent silence of the plains. They left behind a landscape scarred by the recent violence. The ground around the cabin was a churned-up mess of hoofprints and bloodstains, littered with the detritus of battle, spent cartridges, broken arrows, and the hastily dug graves of a dozen men. The cabin itself bore the wounds of the siege like a veteran soldier. Its log walls were pockmarked with bullet holes and studded with arrows, the splintered remains of the front door a gaping maw. But the most profound scars were not the ones etched into the land or the timber. They were the invisible wounds carried by the two survivors. In the days that followed the departure of the cavalry, a new kind of silence descended upon the ranch at Bitter Creek. It was not the tense, expectant silence that had preceded the attack, but a heavy, somber quiet, thick with unspoken thoughts and shared trauma. The easy, if demanding, rhythm of their working partnership was gone, replaced by a strange and awkward distance. They moved around each other with a careful, almost delicate precision, as if they were to pieces of fine china that had been cracked and were in danger of shattering completely. They spoke only when necessary, their conversations limited to the practicalities of their existence, the mending of the door, the rounding up of the scattered cattle, the repair of the damaged corral. Mary, who had found a strange kind of solace in the physical demands of her new life, now found that the work was not enough to quiet the turmoil in her mind. The images of the siege, the faces of the men she had shot, the visceral, terrifying reality of the violence, were branded onto her memory. At night, she would lie awake, the phantom sounds of the battle echoing in her ears, her body tense, her hand reaching for the comforting weight of the revolver she now kept under her pillow. She was haunted not just by the faces of her enemies, but by her own actions. The woman she had become, a woman who could kill without hesitation, was a stranger to her. She looked at her hands, the hands that had once practiced delicate embroidery and played the pianoforte, and saw them as instruments of death. The sense of empowerment she had felt in the immediate aftermath of the battle had been replaced by a deep and settling sense of self-revulsion. Cain, too, was changed. The stoic, unreadable mask he usually wore seemed to have settled more deeply into the lines of his face. He was more withdrawn than ever, his silences longer, his gray eyes clouded with a darkness she had never seen before. He would spend hours staring out at the horizon, his jaw tight, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. She knew, with an intuitive certainty, that he was no stranger to violence. The scars on his knuckles, the faded tracery of a knife wound on his forearm, the way he moved with the deadly efficiency of a predator, all spoke of a past filled with conflict. But this battle, this siege of his home, had clearly dredged up demons he had long thought buried. One evening, as they sat at the table, the flickering lamplight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, Mary could bear the silence no longer. "We need to talk," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Cain looked up from the harness he was mending, his eyes guarded. "About what?" "About what happened. About us." He set down the harness, his movements slow and deliberate. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "There's nothing to talk about. We did what we had to do. We survived. That's all that matters." "Is it?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Is that all that matters? I killed 2 men, Cain. I shot them. I watched them die. And I don't know how to live with that." A flicker of something pain, understanding, a shared sense of damnation passed through his eyes. "You learn," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "Or you don't. There ain't no middle ground out here." "How?" she pleaded, her carefully constructed composure beginning to crumble. "How do you learn? How do you just go on?" He was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant, as if he were looking back through the years, through a lifetime of violence and loss. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with a pain he rarely, if ever, allowed to surface. "You find a reason," he said. "You find something to hold on to, something to fight for, something more than just surviving." He stood up and walked over to a small, battered trunk that sat in the corner of the cabin, a piece of furniture she had never seen him open. He knelt down and lifted the heavy lid. The scent of cedar and old memories filled the small room. He reached inside and pulled out a small, leather-bound book and a faded tintype photograph. He brought them back to the table and laid them down in the pool of lamplight. The book was a Bible, its cover worn smooth with age and use. The photograph was of a woman and a young boy. The woman was beautiful, with a gentle smile and kind eyes. The boy, no older than 7 or 8, had the same unruly dark hair and serious gray eyes as Cain. "My wife, Sarah," Cain said, his voice thick with emotion. "And my son, Daniel." Mary stared at the photograph, a wave of shock and a deep, unexpected pang of sympathy washing over her. She had assumed, in her self-absorbed grief, that she was the only one who had lost everything. It had never occurred to her that this silent, stoic man might be nursing his own profound and terrible sorrow. "They were on their way to join me here," he continued, his voice a low, pained monotone. "I had just finished building this cabin. I had filed the claim on the land. Everything was ready." He paused, swallowing hard, the muscles in his jaw working. It was the caller. On the trail. They never even made it to Fort Laramie. The letter came with a supply wagon a month later. He picked up the Bible, his calloused fingers tracing the worn gold lettering on the cover. This was Sarah's. She was a woman of great faith. She believed in the goodness of things, in forgiveness, in redemption. He looked up, his eyes meeting Mary's, and for the first time, she saw past the hard and yielding facade to the broken man beneath. She saw a man who had been hollowed out by grief, a man who had been wandering in the wilderness of his own sorrow for years. "I came out here to build a life for them," he said, his voice barely a whisper. When they were gone, there was nothing left but the land and the hate. Hate for a world that could be so cruel, so random. He looked around the cabin, at the scars on the walls, the mended door, the empty spaces where a family should have been. 4 years. That's all I had. The work, the fight, just surviving. I didn't know how to do anything else. I didn't want to. He looked back at Mary, his gaze intense, his eyes filled with a raw, painful honesty. And then you came. A ghost. Another victim of this God-forsaken land. And I saw in you the same emptiness I saw in myself. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. His touch was warm, firm, a silent communication of a shared and terrible understanding. "When you asked me to end it," he said, his voice cracking, "I couldn't do it. Because I knew that if I did, I would be killing what was left of myself. Of Sarah. Of the man I once was." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "I told you we would fight. But I wasn't just talking about you. I was talking about me. I needed to fight for something again. Something other than just the memory of what I had lost." The confession hung in the air between them, a raw, vulnerable, and incredibly brave admission of his own brokenness. In that moment, the distance between them, the awkward, careful space they had maintained since the siege, dissolved. They were no longer just two survivors, two strangers bound by circumstance. They were two wounded souls who had found in each other a mirror to their own pain and a reason to keep fighting. Mary turned her hand over, her fingers lacing with his. "I am not Hurricane," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "I cannot replace what you have lost." "I know," he said, his voice regaining some of its strength. "And I am not asking you to. But you are a reason. A reason to build, not just to survive. A reason to hope, not just to endure." They sat there for a long time, their hands clasped, the silence no longer heavy and somber, but filled with a new, fragile sense of hope. The scars of the land were still there, a constant reminder of the violence and the loss. But the scars on their souls, the deep, invisible wounds of grief and trauma, had begun, in that moment of shared vulnerability, to heal. They had found in each other not a cure for their pain, but a companion in it. They were two broken people, two survivors of a harsh and unforgiving land. But together, they were something more. They were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a small, defiant flicker of hope in the vast, overwhelming darkness of the frontier. And for the first time, they both began to believe that they might not just survive, but that they might one day learn to live again. Chapter 6: Seeds of a New Life. The thaw came not just to the high country, where the winter snows finally surrendered to the persistent warmth of the spring sun, but to the small, isolated ranch at Bitter Creek. The shared confession in the dim, lamplit cabin had acted as a kind of emotional spring, breaking up the frozen ground of their grief and allowing something new and fragile to take root. The heavy, somber silence was replaced by a more comfortable quiet, punctuated by easy conversation and the occasional, surprising sound of shared laughter. The work of rebuilding the ranch became a shared enterprise, a tangible manifestation of their decision to build a future rather than simply endure the present. They were no longer just a man and a woman sharing a space, but partners in the truest sense of the word. They worked side by side, their movements falling into a comfortable, efficient rhythm, their shared purpose a silent, binding contract between them. They rebuilt the corral, stronger this time, with thicker posts and heavier rails. They replaced the splintered front door with a new one, fashioned from a massive ponderosa pine cane had felled himself. They even added a small, lean-to greenhouse against the south-facing wall of the cabin, a project that was entirely Mary's idea. "If we are to make a life here," she had announced one morning, her voice filled with a newfound confidence, "then it must be more than just a place of survival. It must be a home. Cain had looked at her, a hint of a smile touching the corners of his mouth. And a home needs a garden. A home needs life, she had replied. Something to nurture. Something to watch grow. And so they had built it, Cain's brute strength and her meticulous planning combining to create a small, sun-drenched space that soon became Mary's sanctuary. She sent away for seeds with a passing supply wagon, and when they arrived, she planted them with the care and reverence of a priestess tending a sacred shrine. Tomatoes, squash, beans, even a few precious flower seeds, marigolds and zinnias that would bring a splash of vibrant, defiant color to their muted, earth-toned world. As the first green shoots began to push their way through the dark, rich soil, Mary felt a sense of hope, of creation. She hadn't experienced since she was a young girl planting a rose garden with her mother. Each new leaf, each tiny, emergent bud, was a small victory against the vast, indifferent wilderness, a testament to the resilience of life in the face of death. Cain, for his part, found himself drawn into her quiet enthusiasm. He would often find himself standing by the greenhouse, watching her as she worked, a strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading through his chest. He had spent so many years locked in a solitary battle with the land, seeing it only as an adversary to be conquered, a force to be endured. Mary was teaching him to see it in a new light, not just as a source of danger and hardship, but as a source of life and beauty. The changes were not just external. The internal landscapes of their souls were also beginning to shift, to reconfigure themselves in the light of their new, shared reality. The nightmares still came, for both of them, but they were less frequent, their sharp edges softened by the comforting presence of another human being in the darkness. One night, Mary awoke with a start, a scream caught in her throat, her body drenched in a cold sweat. She had been dreaming of the raid, of the painted faces, and the screams and the smell of smoke. She sat bolt upright in her narrow cot, her heart hammering against her ribs, the phantom images of the dream still vivid and terrifying. A moment later, the door to her small room creaked open. Cain stood in the doorway, a dark silhouette against the moonlit main room. He didn't speak, but simply crossed the room and sat on the edge of her bed. He didn't touch her, didn't offer any empty words of comfort. He just sat there, his presence a silent, solid anchor in the turbulent sea of her fear. And in his quiet, unwavering presence, she found a strange and profound sense of peace. The phantom images of the dream began to recede, replaced by the solid, reassuring reality of the man sitting beside her. It was the dream again, she whispered, her voice trembling. He nodded, his face unreadable in the darkness. I know, he said, his voice a low rumble. I have them too. It was a simple admission, but it was a powerful one. It was an acknowledgement of their shared trauma, a recognition of the invisible wounds they both carried. And in that shared vulnerability, they found a new level of intimacy, a connection that went deeper than words. They began to talk more, their conversations no longer limited to the practicalities of the ranch. They spoke of their pasts, of the lives they had lived before the West had claimed them. Mary told him of her childhood in Ohio, of her love for books and music, of her dreams of one day becoming a teacher. Cain, in turn, spoke of his life in Missouri, of his apprenticeship as a blacksmith, of his love for the woman who had believed in him, who had encouraged him to seek a new life in the West. They were like two cartographers, slowly, carefully, mapping the uncharted territories of each other's souls. And in the process, they began to discover a surprising and profound sense of compatibility, a shared set of values that transcended their vastly different backgrounds. They were both, at their core, builders. They were both people who found meaning and purpose in the act of creation, whether it was the building of a home, the nurturing of a garden, or the forging of a new life from the ashes of the old. One warm, sun-drenched afternoon, as they were herding a small group of cattle back from a high pasture, Mary's horse stumbled, throwing her to the ground. She landed hard, a sharp, searing pain shooting through her ankle. Cain was off his horse in an instant, his face a mask of concern. He knelt beside her, his hands gently probing her injured ankle. It's broken, he said, his voice grim. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, his strong arms a secure and comforting cradle. He carried her back to the cabin, his long, steady strides eating up the distance. He set her down gently on her bed and then, with a surgeon's precision, he fashioned a splint from a piece of wood and some strips of leather. His touch was surprisingly gentle, his movements deft and sure. As he worked, his face close to hers, Mary found herself studying the landscape of his features, the strong square jaw, the firm line of his mouth, the network of fine lines around his eyes. Lines that spoke not just of hardship, but of a life lived under an open sky. And in his gray eyes, she saw not the cold, flinty hardness she had once perceived, but a deep, quiet strength, a profound and unwavering sense of loyalty. A feeling, warm and unfamiliar, stirred within her. It was a feeling she had thought was lost to her forever, a feeling she had buried along with her family on the plains of Wyoming. It was a feeling of affection, of admiration, of a deep and resonant connection to the man who had saved her, not just from death, but from despair. When he had finished, he looked up, his eyes meeting hers. The air in the small room grew thick with a new and spoken tension. The professional distance between caregiver and patient, between partners in survival, dissolved, replaced by a sudden, sharp awareness of their proximity, of the undeniable and powerful current of attraction that flowed between them. He leaned in, his intention clear. For a fleeting moment, Mary's mind recoiled. The thought of physical intimacy, of surrendering herself to another person, was terrifying. It was a vulnerability she had not allowed herself to contemplate. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw not lust, not possession, but a reflection of her own tentative, burgeoning affection. She saw a man who was as wounded, as cautious, as she was. And in that shared vulnerability, she found not fear, but a sense of rightness, of inevitability. She raised a hand to his face, her fingers tracing the rough stubble on his cheek. It was a gesture of acceptance, of invitation. And then he kissed her. It was not a passionate, demanding kiss, but a slow, gentle exploration, a tentative question asked and answered in the same breath. It was a kiss that spoke of shared sorrow, of hard-won survival, of the fragile, tentative hope for a new beginning. In that moment, in the quiet, sun-drenched cabin, surrounded by the vast, indifferent wilderness, two broken people, two survivors of a harsh and unforgiving land, found in each other not just a reason to survive, but a reason to live. The seeds of a new life, planted in the fertile ground of their shared experience, had finally, miraculously, begun to bloom. Chapter 7. The Ghost of the Past. The kiss was a quiet cataclysm, a gentle earthquake that shifted the very foundations of their relationship. The carefully constructed walls they had built around their wounded hearts, the pragmatic partnership forged in the crucible of survival, crumbled away, revealing the raw, fertile ground of a deeper, more profound connection. The love that grew between them was not a fiery, passionate blaze, but a slow, steady burn, a quiet, resilient flame that provided warmth and light in the vast, often dark, landscape of their lives. Their days were still filled with the hard, unceasing labor of the ranch, but the work was no longer a grim necessity, but a shared act of creation. They were building not just a ranch, but a life, a future, together. Their evenings were filled with a comfortable, easy intimacy, their conversations a rich tapestry woven from the threads of their past experiences and their shared dreams for the future. Mary, who had once seen the West as a vast, terrifying emptiness, now saw it through Cain's eyes, as a land of harsh and forgiving beauty, a place of endless possibility. Cain, who had seen the land as a place of exile, a monument to his own profound and terrible loss, now saw it through Mary's eyes, as a place of healing, of renewal, of a second chance at a life he had thought was lost to him forever. They were two halves of a whole, their strengths and weaknesses complementing each other in a way that made them both stronger. Mary's quiet, thoughtful intelligence tempered Cain's impulsive, action-oriented nature. His unwavering strength and deep, practical knowledge of the land provided a secure foundation for her more optimistic, forward-looking vision. But the past, as they both knew, was not a ghost that could be easily laid to rest. It was a constant presence, a shadow that lurked just beyond the warm, welcoming circle of their firelight. And one day, that shadow took on a human form. He rode in on a tired-looking sorrel, a tall, lean man with a narrow, cruel face and eyes that were as cold and dead as a winter sky. He was dressed in the dusty, travel-worn clothes of a long-distance rider, a brace of pistols strapped to his hips, a repeating rifle resting in a scabbard on his saddle. He reined in his horse at the edge of the yard, his cold eyes taking in the scene, the neatly repaired cabin, the sturdy corral, the small, thriving garden. There was a predatory stillness about him, the cold, watchful energy of a snake. Cain, who had been splitting wood by the side of the cabin, straightened up, the axe held loosely in his hand. He had seen the rider coming from a long way off, had watched his slow, deliberate approach with a growing sense of unease. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was not a casual visitor, not a lost traveler seeking shelter for the night. This was trouble. "Can I help you?" Cain called out, his voice a low, even rumble, devoid of welcome. The stranger dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes never leaving Cain. "Looking for a man," the stranger said, his voice a dry, raspy whisper. "Goes by the name of Cain." "You found him," Cain said, his grip tightening on the axe handle. The stranger's thin lips twisted into a semblance of a smile. "I figured as much. You got the look of him. The look of a man who's seen the elephant." He walked closer, his spurs jingling a soft, metallic dirge in the quiet afternoon air. He stopped a few feet from Cain, his eyes flicking over to the cabin, where Mary had just appeared in the doorway, her face pale with a sudden, inexplicable fear. "And who's this?" the stranger asked, his gaze lingering on Mary with an unnerving, proprietary intensity. "The little woman you set up with after you left your last one to die." The words were a physical blow, a vicious, calculated strike designed to wound. Cain's face, which had been a mask of stoic neutrality, hardened into a granite-like fury. The knuckles of the hand holding the axe were white. "State your business," Cain said, his voice a low, deadly growl, "and then get off my land." The stranger chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. My business is with you, Cain. Or should I say, Abel. That's the name you were born with, ain't it? Abel Forrester." Cain flinched, a barely perceptible tremor that a less observant man might have missed. But the stranger didn't miss it. His smile widened. "Yeah, I thought so," he said. "You can change your name, change your life, run to the end of the goddamn world. But you can't run from what you did. You can't run from who you are." He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "The name's Jedediah Cain. My brother was Marcus Cain. He was the sheriff of a little town in Kansas called Purgatory. A town you and your old partner, Silas the preacher Blackwood, rode through about 10 years ago." The name, Silas Blackwood, seemed to hang in the air, a dark, malevolent presence. Cain's face was a stony, unreadable mask, but Mary, watching from the doorway, could see the turmoil in his eyes, the shadows of a past he had never spoken of. A past that was now coming back to haunt him. "You and Blackwood," Cain continued, his voice dripping with a cold, venomous hatred, "you robbed the bank. And when my brother tried to stop you, you shot him. Shot him in the back. Left him to die in the street like a dog." Cain's voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, ragged whisper. It was Blackwood. He was the one who fired the shot. "I never killed a man who wasn't trying to kill me." "Don't make no difference," Cain snarled. "You were there. You were his partner. You're just as guilty. There's a price on your head, Forrester. $1,000. Enough to set a man up for life. But I ain't here for the money. I'm here for justice. My own kind of justice." He let his hand drift down, his fingers hovering over the butt of his pistol. "I've been hunting you for 10 years, Forrester. 10 long, hard years. I followed your trail from Kansas to Colorado, from the mining camps to the cattle towns. You're a hard man to find. But I knew, sooner or later, you'd get careless. You'd try to build something. You'd let someone get close to you." His cold eyes flicked back to Mary, his smile turning into a cruel, predatory leer. "And it looks like I was right." The world seemed to slow down, the air growing thick and heavy. Mary's heart was a frantic bird, beating against the cage of her ribs. She saw the scene unfold with a terrifying, dreamlike clarity. The cold-eyed bounty hunter, his hand poised over his gun, the man she loved, his face a mask of anguish and fury. A terrible choice laid before him. She knew, with a sudden, sickening certainty, what was about to happen. This was the brutal, unforgiving code of the West, the law of the gun. A man's past was a debt that could only be paid in blood. But Cain didn't reach for his gun. He dropped the axe, the heavy tool thudding into the dirt. He raised his hands, a gesture of surrender. "This is between you and me," Cain said, his voice pleading, desperate. "She has nothing to do with it. Let her go." Cain laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Let her go? I don't think so. She's my insurance. My guarantee that you won't do anything stupid." He drew his pistol, the movement a fluid, deadly blur. He leveled it at Cain's chest. "Now, you're gonna turn around, real slow, and you're gonna walk towards the corral. We're gonna take a little ride. And the lady here," he said, his eyes glinting with a cruel, sadistic light, "she's gonna come with us." The thought of being in this man's power, of being used as a pawn in his twisted game of revenge, was more terrifying than any Comanche war party. Mary knew that she could not let that happen. She would not be a helpless victim again. She backed away from the door, her mind racing. The shotgun. It was just inside, leaning against the wall. She moved with a silent, desperate urgency, her bare feet making no sound on the rough-hewn floorboards. She grabbed the heavy weapon, her hands surprisingly steady. She checked the load, the two massive brass shells a comforting, deadly weight. She moved back to the doorway, her heart pounding a frantic, deafening rhythm in her ears. She could see them now, Cain walking slowly, his back to her, his hands still raised, Cain a few feet behind him, the gun still leveled at Cain's back. She raised the shotgun, the stock cool and solid against her cheek. She took a deep breath, just as Cain had taught her. She aimed not at Cain, but at the ground just in front of him. She squeezed the trigger. The shotgun roared, the blast a deafening explosion that shattered the afternoon silence. The ground in front of Cain erupted in a spray of dirt and gravel. He stumbled back, a cry of surprise and pain escaping his lips, his shot going wild, the bullet kicking up a puff of dust a few feet from Cain. The moment of surprise was all Cain needed. He whirled around, his body a coiled spring of pent-up fury. He closed the distance between them into long strides and slammed his fist into Cain's jaw. The sound of the blow was a sickening, whip crack. Cain staggered back, his gun flying from his hand. He was a tough man, a seasoned fighter, but he was no match for Cain's raw, explosive power. Cain was on him in an instant, his hands closing around Cain's throat, his face a mask of primal, murderous rage. He was going to kill him, with his bare hands. "Cain, no!" Mary screamed, her voice cutting through the red haze of his fury. He froze, his hands still locked around Cain's throat, the man's face a mottled, purplish mask. He looked over at Mary, his eyes wild, his chest heaving. And in her eyes, he saw not fear, but a reflection of his own humanity. He saw the woman who had taught him to hope again, to build again, to be more than just a creature of violence and survival. He released his grip, his breath coming in ragged, shuddering gasps. Cain slumped to the ground, coughing and sputtering, his face a mask of terror and disbelief. Cain stood over him, his body trembling with the aftershocks of his rage. He had come so close to becoming the man he used to be, the man he had spent 10 years trying to escape. He looked at Mary, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame, gratitude, and a love so profound it was almost painful to behold. She had saved him, not just from Cain, but from himself. The ghost of the past had come to their door, a harbinger of death and destruction. But it had not destroyed them. It had, in a strange and terrible way, made them stronger. It had forced them to confront the darkness within themselves and to choose the light. The past was not a debt that had to be paid in blood. It was a scar, a wound that could be healed. And in the quiet, sun-drenched yard of their small, isolated ranch, two wounded souls, two survivors of a harsh and unforgiving land, had found in each other the strength to do just that, to heal, and to build a future, not on the shifting sands of a forgotten past, but on the solid, unshakable foundation of their love. Chapter 8: A Town Called Redemption. The aftermath of Jedediah Cain's arrival was a landscape of difficult choices. He lay bound and gagged in the small, dark root cellar, a living, breathing testament to the past that Cain could no longer outrun. For 2 days, a tense, heavy silence hung over the ranch as Cain and Mary wrestled with the impossible question of what to do with him. To let him go was to invite him back, perhaps with others, to continue his relentless, vengeful quest. To kill him was to cross a line that Cain had fought so hard to avoid, to become the very man Cain accused him of being. It was Mary who finally broke the stalemate, her voice a beacon of clear, unwavering morality in the fog of Cain's turmoil. "We cannot become what we are fighting against," she said, her hand resting on his arm, her touch a grounding force. "We cannot answer violence with more violence, hatred with more hatred. There is a law in this land, a law beyond the gun. We must trust in it." And so, with a heavy heart and a profound sense of foreboding, Cain made his decision. He would take Cain to the nearest town with a sheriff and a jail, a place called Redemption, a good 2 days' ride to the south. He would turn him over to the authorities, along with the $1,000 bounty on his own head. He would face the past, not with a gun, but with the truth. It was a terrifying prospect, a gamble that could cost him his freedom, his ranch, his new life with Mary. But it was the only choice that would allow him to live with himself, to be the man he wanted to be for her. He would not, however, allow Mary to come with him. The journey was too dangerous, the outcome too uncertain. She would stay at the ranch, a decision she fought against with a fierce, protective loyalty, but one on which he would not yield. "This is my fight," he told her, his hands framing her face, his eyes filled with a love that was both a strength and an ache in his chest. "I will not have you pay the price for my past." He left at dawn, a grim, solitary figure riding into the rising sun, the bound and sullen bounty hunter trailing behind him on a lead rope. Mary watched him go, a knot of fear tightening in her stomach, until he was just a small, distant speck on the vast, empty canvas of the plains. The 2 days that followed were the longest of her life. The ranch, once a sanctuary, a place of healing and growth, felt empty and silent, the quiet amplifying her fears, her anxieties. She threw herself into her work, her hands busy with the familiar, comforting rhythms of the garden, the mending, the baking. But her mind was far away, on a dusty trail to a town called Redemption. Cain, for his part, rode with a heavy heart, the weight of his past a physical presence on his shoulders. The journey was a silent, tense affair, broken only by Cain's occasional, muttered threats and curses. Cain ignored them, his mind focused on the difficult task ahead. Redemption was a typical frontier town, a single, dusty main street lined with a collection of rough-hewn wooden buildings, a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith shop, and a small, unassuming building with a faded sign that read Sheriff. Cain dismounted, his movements stiff and weary from the long ride. He pulled the bound bounty hunter from his horse and half-dragged, half-carried him into the sheriff's office. The sheriff was a man well past his prime, with a kind, weary face and a magnificent, drooping mustache. He looked up from his paperwork, his eyes widening in surprise at the sight of the 2 men who had just stumbled through his door. "Sheriff," Cain said, his voice raw with exhaustion and nerves, "my name is Abel Forrester. There's a $1,000 bounty on my head for a bank robbery in Purgatory, Kansas, 10 years ago. This man, Jedediah Cain, is a bounty hunter who came to collect it. I've come to turn myself in." The sheriff, whose name was Elias Thorne, stared at him, his expression a mixture of disbelief and a dawning, weary understanding. He had been a lawman for 30 years, and he had seen more than his fair share of strange and desperate men. But he had never seen anything quite like this. A wanted man turning himself in, with his own bounty hunter in tow. He listened patiently as Cain told his story, his voice a low, steady monotone, his words a simple, and adorned account of the facts. He spoke of his partnership with Silas Blackwood, of the robbery, of the shooting of Sheriff Cain. He did not make excuses, did not try to absolve himself of his role in the crime. He simply told the truth. When he was finished, a long silence filled the small, dusty office. Sheriff Thorne stroked his mustache, his wise, tired eyes studying the man who stood before him. He had a knack for reading men, a skill honed by years of dealing with the liars, cheats, and killers who washed up on the shores of the frontier. And in this man, Abel Forrester, he saw not a cold-blooded killer, but a man who had been running from his past for a very long time, a man who had finally decided to stop running. "And this man, Silas Blackwood?" the sheriff asked, his voice a gentle, probing query. "Where is he now?" "I don't know," Cain said. "We parted ways after the robbery. I heard he went south, to Texas, maybe even Mexico. He's a ghost. A phantom." The sheriff nodded slowly. He had heard the name before. Silas the preacher Blackwood. A man who quoted scripture while he robbed and killed, a ruthless, charismatic psychopath who had left a trail of blood and tears across the territory. "And you, Mr. Kane," the sheriff said, turning his attention to the bounty hunter, "you have anything to add to this story?" Kane, who had been listening with a sullen, impotent fury, spat on the floor. "He's a liar and a murderer," he snarled. "He shot my brother in the back. He deserves to hang." The sheriff sighed, a long, weary sound. He had dealt with men like Kane before, men whose grief had curdled into a bitter, all-consuming hatred, men who saw the world in stark, simple terms of black and white, good and evil. He stood up and took a set of keys from a hook on the wall. He unlocked Kane's bonds and then, to the bounty hunter's astonishment, he motioned him towards one of the two cells at the back of the office. "What the hell is this?" Kane sputtered, his face a mask of outrage. "This," the sheriff said, his voice suddenly hard as iron, "is you being placed under arrest for assault, kidnapping, and threatening the life of a citizen of this territory. Whatever happened 10 years ago in Kansas is a matter for the circuit judge to decide. But what happened 2 days ago, on Mr. Forrester's ranch, that's my jurisdiction. And in my town, we have laws. We don't settle our disputes with a gun." He locked the cell door, leaving Kane to rage and curse in the darkness. He then turned back to Kane, his expression softening. "As for you, Mr. Forrester," he said, "the law says I have to hold you until the judge arrives. He's due in a week or 2. But I don't see the need for you to be in a cell. You're not a flight risk. You came here of your own free will. You can stay at the boarding house. Just don't leave town." Kane stared at him, a wave of disbelief and a profound, overwhelming sense of gratitude washing over him. He had expected a cell, a trial, a hangman's noose. He had not expected mercy. The days that followed were a strange, surreal limbo. Kane found a room at the local boarding house and spent his days in a state of anxious, suspended animation, waiting for the arrival of the circuit judge who held his fate in his hands. He sent a letter to Mary with a passing freight wagon, telling her what had happened, telling her not to worry, telling her that for the first time in a long time, he had a strange, unfamiliar feeling of hope. He also learned that he was not alone in his vigil. The town of Redemption, it seemed, had a long and complicated history with Silas the preacher Blackwood. A few years back, Blackwood and his gang had ridden through, robbing the bank, killing 2 innocent townsfolk in the process. The town had not forgotten. They had not forgiven. The news of Blackwood's former partner turning himself in spread through the small community like a prairie fire. Kane found himself the subject of curious stares, of whispered conversations. But he also found something he had not expected, a surprising and profound sense of community, of a shared and terrible understanding. He found it in the quiet nod of the blacksmith, a man whose brother had been one of Blackwood's victims. He found it in the gentle, compassionate eyes of the boarding house owner, a widow whose husband had been killed in a saloon brawl a few years back. He found it in the surprisingly friendly and philosophical conversations he had with Sheriff Thorne, a man who believed in the possibility of redemption, not just as the name of his town, but as a guiding principle of his life. These were people who understood the brutal and forgiving nature of the West. They understood that a man's past did not have to define his future. They understood that a man could change, could atone, could be redeemed. And as he waited, a profound and powerful shift occurred within him. The weight of his past, the heavy burden of his guilt and shame, began to lift. He had come to redemption to face a judge, to face the law. But in the process, he had found something far more important. He had found a community. He had found a sense of belonging. He had found forgiveness, not just from others, but from himself. The trial, when it finally came, was a simple, straightforward affair. The circuit judge, a stern but fair-minded man named Jedediah Black, listened patiently to the testimony of Kane and Sheriff Thorne. He reviewed the 10-year-old warrant from Kansas, his expression grim. When the testimony was finished, he looked down at Kane, his eyes piercing, his voice a low, resonant baritone. "Mr. Forrester," he said, "the law is clear. You were an accomplice to a crime, a serious crime that resulted in the death of a lawman. The fact that you did not fire the fatal shot does not absolve you of your guilt. The law demands a punishment." A hush fell over the small, crowded courtroom. Kane's heart sank. This was it, the end of the road. However, the judge continued, his voice taking on a different tone. "The law also allows for discretion. It allows for a consideration of the circumstances. It allows for the possibility of redemption." He looked out at the faces of the townspeople who had crowded into the courtroom, a silent testament of their support for the quiet, solitary rancher who had won their respect. He looked at Sheriff Thorne, a man whose judgment he trusted implicitly. "I have heard the testimony of Sheriff Thorne," he said. "I have heard of your actions in defending your home, of your courage in confronting your past. I have seen the support of this community, a community that has its own painful history with the man you once called your partner." He paused, letting his words sink in. "It is my judgment," he said, his voice ringing with a solemn authority, "that you have already served your sentence. 10 years of running, of looking over your shoulder, of living in the shadow of your past. That is a prison of its own kind." He banged his gavel on the wooden bench, the sound a sharp, final punctuation mark. "I am suspending your sentence. The bounty is rescinded. You are a free man, Mr. Forrester. You are free to return to your ranch, to your life. You are free to be the man you have become, not the man you once were." A wave of shock, of disbelief, of a joy so profound it was almost painful, washed over Kane. He staggered out of the courtroom, into the bright, welcoming sunlight, a free man. He was met on the steps by a crowd of well-wishers, by the firm, congratulatory handshake of Sheriff Thorne, by the warm, tearful embrace of the boarding house owner. But he was looking for only one face, one person. And then he saw her. Mary. She was standing at the edge of the crowd, a vision of radiant, hopeful beauty, her face streaked with tears, her eyes shining with a love that was a beacon, a homecoming. He pushed his way through the crowd, his eyes locked on hers. He didn't speak, couldn't speak. He simply opened his arms, and she came to him, her body fitting against his as if it were made to be there. He held her, his face buried in her hair, the scent of her, the feel of her, a grounding, life-affirming reality. He was home. He had come to a town called Redemption seeking justice. He had left with something far more precious. He had left with his life, his freedom, and the love of a woman who had taught him how to live again. The ghost of the past had been laid to rest, not by a bullet, but by the quiet, courageous act of telling the truth. And as they rode out of town, their faces turned towards the future. They both knew that their greatest adventure was just beginning. Chapter 9: The Preacher's Shadow. The ride back to Bitter Creek was a journey of quiet celebration. The oppressive weight of Kane's past, a burden he had carried for a decade, had been lifted, leaving in its place a profound sense of lightness and a boundless, exhilarating freedom. The future, which had once seemed a narrow and certain path through a dark and dangerous wilderness, now stretched before them, a wide, open road, bathed in the warm, golden light of a new dawn. They returned to a ranch that was no longer just a refuge, but a home, a place of their own making, a testament to their shared resilience and their love for each other. The small, thriving garden was a riot of color, the marigolds and zinnias a vibrant, defiant splash of beauty against the rugged, muted tones of the landscape. The newly built door was a symbol of their new beginning, a threshold they had crossed together, leaving the ghosts of the past behind them. Life settled into a new, more peaceful rhythm. The hard, physical labor of the ranch was no longer a grim battle for survival, but a joyful, creative act. They were not just working the land, but nurturing it, pouring their hopes and dreams into the rich, fertile soil. Their love for each other deepened, matured, took on the quiet, comfortable strength of an old, weathered oak. They were more than just lovers, they were partners in every sense of the word, their lives intertwined, their souls in perfect, harmonious rhythm. But the West was a land of shadows, a place where the past was never truly buried, where the seeds of violence, once planted, could lie dormant for years, only to sprout again, with a terrible, deadly force. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a rumor, a whisper on the wind carried by a traveling tinker who stopped at the ranch for a night. He spoke of a new terror in the territory, a ruthless gang of outlaws led by a charismatic, scripture-spouting madman who called himself the Preacher. They had been robbing banks, stagecoaches, and isolated homesteads, leaving a trail of death and destruction in their wake. The name sent a chill down Kane's spine, a cold, familiar dread that he had not felt since the day Jedediah Kane had ridden into his yard. Silas Blackwood was back. He tried to dismiss it as a coincidence, a case of mistaken identity. But deep down, he knew. He knew the man's methods, his madness, his particular brand of righteous, self-justifying violence. A few weeks later, the rumor became a terrifying reality. A neighboring ranch, a good day's ride to the east, was attacked. The family, a kind, hard-working couple with 2 young children, was slaughtered, their home burned to the ground. The lone survivor, a young ranch hand who had managed to hide in the root cellar, spoke of a tall, gaunt man with piercing blue eyes who had quoted the Book of Revelations while he did his terrible work. The shadow of Silas Blackwood had fallen across their peaceful valley. Cain and Mary knew that they were next. Their ranch, isolated and remote, was a perfect target. They were faced with a terrible choice: to run, to abandon the home they had built, the life they had forged, or to stay and fight, to make a stand against the darkness that was threatening to consume them. There was, in the end, no choice at all. This was their home. They would not surrender it. They began to prepare for a war. The lessons of the first siege were not forgotten. They fortified the cabin, stockpiled ammunition, planned their defense with a grim, methodical efficiency. But this time, it was different. This was not a battle against a faceless enemy, a tribe of warriors fighting for their land and their honor. This was a battle against a monster, a man Cain had once called his partner, a man who represented the darkest, most violent chapter of his own past. The waiting was a special kind of hell. Every day, they would scan the horizon, every dust devil, every distant rider, a potential threat. The nights were long and tense, the familiar sounds of the prairie transformed into harbingers of doom. He came, as Cain knew he would, at dusk, on a day when the sky was a bruised, angry purple, the air thick with the promise of a coming storm. He did not come with an army of whooping warriors, but with a small, hand-picked group of killers, their faces as hard and merciless as the land they rode through. And at their head was Silas Blackwood. He was just as Cain remembered him, tall and gaunt, with a wild, flowing mane of white hair and eyes that burned with a feverish, fanatical light. He was dressed in a long, black duster, a Bible clutched in one hand, a massive, silver-plated revolver in the other. He reined in his horse at the edge of the yard, his piercing blue eyes fixing on Cain, who stood on the porch of the cabin, a Winchester rifle held loosely in his hands. "Abel, my son," Blackwood called out, his voice a rich, resonant baritone, a voice that could charm a bird from a tree or condemn a man to hell. "The prodigal has returned. Have you come to welcome your brother home?" "You are no brother of mine, Silas," Cain said, his voice a low, steady growl. "And this is not your home. Turn around and ride away. There's nothing for you here but a grave." Blackwood threw back his head and laughed, a sound that was both joyful and utterly insane. "A grave? Oh, there will be graves, my boy. There will be a cleansing, a purification by fire. The Lord has sent me to redeem this valley, to wash it clean of the filth of the unrighteous." He dismounted, his movements slow and theatrical, like a preacher taking the pulpit. His men spread out, taking up positions, their rifles trained on the cabin. "I heard you found a new life for yourself, Abel," Blackwood said, his voice taking on a soft, conversational tone. "Found a little woman. Started to play house. Did you think you could just walk away? Did you think you could escape the path the Lord has chosen for us?" He took a step closer, his eyes burning with a messianic zeal. "We were partners, Abel. We were chosen. We were the scourges of God, sent to punish the wicked and the greedy. You lost your way. You succumbed to the temptations of the flesh, to the false idols of home and hearth. But it's not too late. You can still be saved. You can rejoin me. We can ride together again." "That man is dead," Cain said, his voice cold and flat. "You killed him, Silas. You and your madness." Blackwood's face darkened, the charismatic mask of the preacher slipping to reveal the twisted, malevolent face of the killer beneath. "Then you will die with him," he hissed. "And your whore with you." He raised his revolver. "The wages of sin is death," he roared, his voice the crack of doom. But before he could fire, a shout rang out from the window of the cabin. Blackwood jerked, a look of stunned surprise on his face, a small, dark hole appearing in his shoulder. He staggered back, his revolver falling from his hand. It was Mary. She stood in the window, the smoking rifle in her hands, her face a mask of pale, fierce determination. The shot was a signal. The yard erupted into a maelstrom of gunfire, a chaotic, deadly symphony of hate and fury. It was a battle not for land, not for money, but for the soul of a man, for the future of a home, for the very definition of redemption. Cain fought with a cold, desperate fury, not just for his life, but for the life of the woman he loved, for the future they had built together. He was no longer the reluctant killer, the man haunted by his past. He was a protector, a guardian, a husband fighting for his home. Blackwood's men were seasoned killers, but they were no match for the fortified position of the cabin and the desperate and wavering courage of its two defenders. One by one, they fell, their bodies joining the scarred, blood-soaked earth of the ranch at Bitter Creek. Soon, only Blackwood was left. He stood in the middle of the yard, a wounded, cornered animal, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. His plan, his divine mission, had been shattered. His army of righteous killers was dead. He looked at Cain, his eyes filled with a lifetime of shared history, of camaraderie that had curdled into a bitter, murderous hatred. "This is between you and me, Abel," he snarled, pulling a long, wicked-looking knife from his boot. "No guns, just the judgment of God." He charged, the knife held high, his face a mask of insane, suicidal fury. Cain threw down his rifle. He met the charge head-on, his body a solid, immovable wall of bone and muscle. The two men, once partners, once brothers in crime, came together in a final, brutal embrace of death. They were a whirlwind of motion, a maelstrom of grunts and curses and the sickening, wet thud of fists on flesh. It was a battle of two opposing forces, the dark, nihilistic madness of Blackwood and the quiet and wavering strength of Cain. It was a battle for the soul of the West itself, a battle between the forces of destruction and the forces of creation. In the end, it was not strength, but love, that won the day. As Blackwood raised his knife for a final, killing blow, Cain saw, over the preacher's shoulder, the face of Mary, watching from the window, her eyes wide with terror and a fierce, unwavering belief in him. The sight of her, the thought of the life they had built, the future they had dreamed of, gave him a strength he didn't know he possessed. He caught Blackwood's wrist, the steel of the knife just inches from his throat. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, he twisted, the sound of snapping bone a sharp, sickening crack in the sudden silence. Blackwood screamed, a high, thin sound of pure, unadulterated agony. The knife fell from his nerveless fingers. Cain stood over him, his chest heaving, his body a symphony of pain. He looked down at the broken, whimpering man at his feet, the man who had been his mentor, his partner, his curse. And in that moment, he felt not hatred, not triumph, but a profound and overwhelming sense of pity. Pity for a man whose faith had become a twisted, murderous madness, whose soul had been consumed by the very darkness he claimed to be fighting against. He did not kill him. To do so would have been an act of vengeance, not of justice. He simply walked away, leaving the preacher to his own personal hell, a hell of his own making. He stumbled back to the cabin, into the waiting arms of the woman who was his anchor, his salvation, his home. The shadow of the preacher was gone, vanquished not by a bullet, but by the quiet, unshakable power of a love that had refused to be extinguished. The final battle was over, and in the quiet, blood-soaked yard of their small, isolated ranch, a new day was dawning. Chapter 10. The Horizon's Promise. The storm that had threatened on the horizon broke that night, a violent, cleansing deluge that washed the blood from the thirsty ground and scrubbed the air clean of the acrid scent of gunpowder. Cain and Mary huddled together by the fire, the sound of the rain on the roof a comforting, percussive rhythm, a final, definitive end to the violence that had plagued their lives. The bodies of Blackwood's men were buried in the morning, their unmarked graves a somber, final testament to the destructive power of a twisted and hateful ideology. Blackwood himself, his arm broken, his spirit shattered, was tied to his horse and sent on his way, a broken, pathetic figure, his prophecies of doom and damnation reduced to the incoherent, impotent ramblings of a madman. He was no longer a threat, no longer a ghost from the past. He was just a man, a sad, broken man who had lost his way. In the days and weeks that followed, a profound and lasting peace settled over the ranch at Bitter Creek. The scars of the battle, both on the land and on their souls, began to fade, replaced by the quiet, steady growth of a new and hopeful future. The news of Blackwood's defeat, carried by the same invisible currents of rumor and gossip that had once spread fear and terror, now spread a sense of relief and a grudging, hard-won respect for the quiet, solitary rancher and his fiercely courageous wife. They were no longer seen as outsiders, as strangers in a strange land, but as a part of the fabric of the community, as people who had faced the darkness and had not been found wanting. Sheriff Thorne rode out from Redemption a few weeks later, a small posse of deputies in tow. He had come to investigate the reports of the gunfight, to see for himself the aftermath of the final, bloody confrontation. He found not a scene of carnage, but a scene of quiet, domestic tranquility. He found a man and a woman working side by side in their garden, their faces turned towards the sun, their movements a comfortable, easy dance of long-practiced partnership. He looked at the neatly repaired cabin, at the sturdy corral, at the vibrant, thriving garden. He looked at the quiet, unshakable strength in Kane's eyes, at the calm, confident beauty of the woman who stood beside him. And he knew that there was no crime here. There was only justice. A hard-won frontier justice, a justice that had been meted out not by a judge and a jury, but by the people who had refused to surrender their home, their lives, their love, to the forces of darkness and chaos. He tipped his hat, a gesture of profound and heartfelt respect. "Looks like you had a bit of a spring cleanin'," he said, or I smiled touching his lips. "Something like that," Kane said, his own lips twisting into a rare, genuine smile. The sheriff and his men did not stay long. They shared a cup of coffee, exchanged a few pleasantries, and then they were gone, leaving Kane and Mary once again to the quiet, peaceful solitude of their home. Life went on. The seasons turned. The harsh and forgiving winter gave way to the gentle, hopeful spring. The blazing, relentless summer mellowed into the cool, golden autumn. They expanded the ranch, their small herd of cattle growing, their fields of hay and corn pushing back the wilderness, a small, defiant island of civilization in a vast, untamed sea. They became a part of the land, their lives governed by its ancient, immutable rhythms. They learned its secrets, its moods, its dangers, and its beauties. They were no longer just survivors, but settlers, pioneers, builders of a new world. One day, as they stood on the porch of their cabin, watching the sun set over the distant, purple mountains, Mary turned to Kane, her hand resting on her still flat stomach, a quiet, joyful secret shining in her eyes. "We're going to need a bigger house," she said, her voice a soft, happy whisper. Kane looked at her, a wave of emotion so profound, so overwhelming, that it almost brought him to his knees, washing over him. He had faced death, had confronted the ghosts of his past, had fought for his life and his home. But nothing had prepared him for the sheer, unadulterated joy of this moment. He pulled her to him, his arms wrapping around her in a fierce, protective embrace. He was no longer just a rancher, just a husband. He was a father-to-be, a patriarch, a man who had been given a second chance, not just at life, but at a family. He had come to the West seeking a new life, a place to escape his past. He had found something far more precious. He had found a home. He had found a purpose. He had found a love that had redeemed him, had healed him, had made him whole. The story of the rancher and the woman he had saved became a part of the legend of the West, a story told around campfires and in dusty saloons, a story of survival, of courage, of the transformative power of love. They were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a living, breathing embodiment of the promise of the frontier, the promise that a person could start over, could be reborn, could build a new life from the ashes of the old. They had faced the worst that this wild and forgiving land could throw at them. They had faced the darkness within themselves and the darkness of the world around them. And they had not just survived. They had triumphed. And as they stood there, in the fading light of a perfect western day, their faces turned towards the future, they knew that their story was far from over. It was just beginning. The horizon was vast and open, filled with the promise of a new day, a new life, a new generation, a new beginning. In the heart of the wild, untamed West, they had found their home. They had found their peace. They had found their redemption. And it was a redemption they had earned, a redemption they had built together.